You know that saying, there's no time like the present? Well, registration is officially open for the next class of FAMM. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Whether you're a women's health professional with a busy practice or you're in the midst of a professional training program, FAMM is what you've been waiting for. By the time you finish your FAMM certification, you'll have the skills to confidently teach fertility awareness to your clients, interpret all kinds of complex charting scenarios, and you'll have the step-by-step protocols you need to help your clients improve their hormone and menstrual cycle health. Classes start towards the end of June, and early bird registration is open until June 14th. Apply today at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 521. In today's episode, I am tackling one of the most common, prevalent, and persistent myths about the menstrual cycle, which is menstrual cycle length. The myth that all menstrual cycles are 28 days and that ovulation occurs always on day 14. And what's great about this episode is that I have a fantastic study to share with you. This study is one of the first of its kind with the advent of menstrual cycle apps. In the study, they mention that there are over 100 fertility awareness-based mobile apps with over 200 million downloads. And so, although it's questionable, the whole topic of how they use our data and are they selling my data and etc. Well, yes, they are, unless the company specifically has a different model for especially the free apps, because you got to think to yourself, if something's free, you're usually the product. But with that said, with all of those ethical implications considered, when we have this type of data, it really gives us an interesting opportunity to learn a lot more about the menstrual cycle. And so in the study that we're going to talk about today, they did just that. They gathered data from the many, many users of one of the apps, and they analyzed over 600,000 real world menstrual cycles. So, there's pros and cons of doing something like this, because this is a passive analysis of existing data. It's not that these women enrolled in a study and they were told to do anything in particular. They were just users of this app, and, these researchers were able to extract that data. But either way, it gives us a really interesting insight into a huge amount of menstrual cycles in the real world. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today, comparing it to the common myth that menstrual cycles are always 14 days or always 28 days, and ovulation is always taking place on day 14. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. You'll find the link to today's study over at fertilityfriday.com/521. And the study that we're going to be going over today is called Real World Menstrual Cycle Characteristics of More Than 600,000 Menstrual Cycles. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, this study analyzes over 600,000 menstrual cycles, which is really, really interesting. And a little bit of background data, they had, according to the study, over 120,000 what they called anonymized users of the app. These women were residents of Sweden, the UK, and the USA, and the average age was about 30 years old. The range was between age 18 and 45. And they had all this data just to give us a background of the users. 80% had started using the app specifically to prevent pregnancy, and 20% had used the app specifically to plan pregnancy. And there was somewhere between an average of about 8 to 9 cycles per user. So they had tons of cycles to choose from. They said out of 1.4 million cycles that were recorded by all eligible users, they actually excluded quite a bit. So they kept cycles that were within a certain range. Only cycles between 10 and 90 days were included, and they excluded cycles where they could not detect and confirm ovulation. And that left them with just over 600,000 cycles to include in the study. So this gives us some really interesting data. I think I'll just start with some of the things that really stood out to me. One of the stats that they shared in the study was that out of all of the cycles, so out of all 600,000, plus cycles, only 13% of those cycles were actually 28 days long. So I think that is a really useful statistic. There was a separate study that I have quoted before that looked at this question in a different way. They looked at, how many cycles actually had ovulation on day 14. And it was a similar stat, it was like 13.5%. So that gives us a sense of what's really going on here. It's not just me saying it. It's something that I've certainly observed. It's not to say women never ovulate on day 14. Of course they do. But the vast majority of the time, so according to this study, 87% of the time, they don't. And I think that that's a really key, useful takeaway. So in the real world, when we're looking at real women, this is the reality of the situation. So when we're looking at whether it's planning ahead for conception and looking to time sex, or whether you're looking to avoid pregnancy or just to understand what's happening in your cycle, this is really helpful to know. There's variation. That's the biggest takeaway. There's variation in women's menstrual cycles. What the researchers found was that although we can look at the averages and we can look at the mean results and all of that kind of stuff, mean meaning average, the general takeaway is that we do have a lot of variation within a certain range. And that certainly lends itself to this result where only 13% of the cycles were 28 days long. And when we break down the data even further, the average follicular phase length was 15.4 days. So then on average, if we had to look at the middle of it, women are ovulating on day 15 on average. And the luteal phase, so the second half of the cycle, the average was 12.6 days. So that also gives us interesting insights. So if I want to spell it out, it means that women commonly ovulate either ahead, like a few days before, a few days after. It's actually normal to kind of ovulate at, not to say at totally different times of the cycle or anything. Some really helpful background data for those of you who may not know is that the average cycle is about 29 days in length, which is exactly in line with what this study found. And the average ovulation tends to happen around day 15. But if we are looking at what it makes up a normal cycle tends to fall somewhere between 24 and 35 days in length. And in order for a cycle to fall in that range, ovulation does have to take place, generally speaking, between about days 10 and 23 or so. So according to their data, the overall average follicular phase length was 16.9 days. When they broke it down based on cycle length, for women who had a typical cycle length of about 25 to 30 days, the average follicular phase was about 15 days, which makes sense because if your cycle is kind of within that typical range, closer to that kind of 28-day average, then the average ovulation would have to be around day 15 in order for the math to work. But the researchers went on to say that for women with normal but longer cycles, so women whose cycles were 31 to 35 days, so still within that normal range, their average date of ovulation was about 19.5. And then women who had shorter cycles, so cycles that fell between 21 to 24 days, the average ovulation took place on, about day 12. So it was, 12.4 days of a follicular phase length. And they even added further that in very short cycles, so shorter than 20 days, the average follicular phase length was 10 days, meaning that in some scenarios, women are even ovulating earlier than that. And on the flip side, in women with very long cycles, so cycles that were 36 to 50 days, the average follicular phase length was about 26.8 days. So what we have here is a whole lot of fluctuation. There are women who are ovulating before day 10 of their cycle, and there are women who are ovulating after day 30 of their cycle. Obviously, this, some of this data is falling outside of what we would consider the optimal range. But at the end of the day, the length of the follicular phase or the date of ovulation is the most significant factor in determining whether a cycle will be short or long. since a woman can only ovulate once per cycle, despite some of the myths out there about women being able to ovulate more than once, that is the strongest part of this equation to determine the length of the menstrual cycle. If women can ovulate before day 10 and after day 30, and if the cycle lengths can range from, according to this study, shorter cycles, even 20 days or less, to longer cycles up to 90 days as they were studying, then of course it means that ovulation can take place at a wide variety of ranges. Now, when we're looking to identify what is normal and optimal, we still are looking at ideally a cycle that is under 35 days, somewhere between 24 to 35 days, generally speaking. And we are looking for that ovulation to take place somewhere between days 10 and 23. But that does not mean that ovulation can't take place outside of that, particularly in cycles where we might need to be looking a little bit deeper. But, with all of that being said, the average in this study and many other studies is typically very, very consistent. Average ovulation across the board typically does fall around 15, cycle day 15 on average. And the overall cycle length does typically land somewhere around 29 days. After viewing many, many studies, this data is quite consistent. So again, what's great about this study is that it does give us real world data. And because of the just massive size of the study, it does give us a really, really interesting insight into what's really happening here. There was a couple other things that I thought were interesting about the study. One of the things that I highlighted was just a comment that the researchers made about the luteal phase. So the researcher said, "It is remarkable that short cycles had a significantly reduced luteal phase relative to normal length cycles. But conversely, very long cycles had a significantly long follicular phase, and the luteal phase didn't vary much." So let me just say that again in a little bit more approachable language. So they're saying that they found that short cycles had a shorter luteal phase relative to normal cycles. So they're saying if the cycle was shorter, the luteal phase tended to be shorter. But when the cycle was longer, the luteal phase didn't really vary that much from normal cycles. So the overall point was that, the luteal phase is the most consistent part of the menstrual cycle. However, in this study, the researchers did highlight another myth, which is that the myth is that the luteal phase is always 14 days. And it is not. There is a range. So although the range is more narrow in terms of how much variation can actually take place in a luteal phase, there is variation. So the luteal phase can vary anywhere from 7 to 19 days. Now, I'm always a little bit more skeptical of some of the research that looks at the luteal phases in, 18 days, 19 days, because some of the ways that they're measuring the beginning of that luteal phase may or may not be the most accurate. So when you're looking at LH testing strips and things like that, although they provide a very useful indicator to estimate when ovulation is taking place, LH strips turn positive 24 to 36 hours prior to ovulation. So sometimes I think that some of those longer luteal phases may not be as accurate. What I've seen from my own experience is I would probably be more comfortable putting a maximum of 17 days because you don't really see luteal phases that are longer than that on a regular basis. But either way, even if we kind of go with my interpretation here, 7 days to 17 days is a much shorter range than the follicular phases that we've been talking about that can really range up to, over 20, 30 days, depending on the scenario if the cycles are out of optimal range. So I thought it was really interesting that they pointed this out and they noted that it was remarkable. But when we look at how the menstrual cycle works, after ovulation, the follicle releases an ovary, and that ovarian follicle then transforms into the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum it's also called the yellow body. It's something that would be visible if we were to look at the ovary with our naked eye or with a laparoscopic camera or something like that. And this temporary endocrine gland forms on the ovary, releases progesterone for the duration of the luteal phase. If the egg is not fertilized, then it does have it has a certain life span. And after that lifespan, if the egg is not fertilized and it's not how the research sometimes mentions it is if the egg is fertilized, it starts to produce HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and that kind of rescues the corpus luteum and prevents its demise. So if the corpus luteum is not essentially rescued by this fertilized egg and the hormones that it starts to produce, alerting the body that there is actually, life growing here and it needs to continue producing progesterone, then it disintegrates. So there's a limited lifespan on the corpus luteum. And so therefore it just can't just keep going and going and going. So this is a physiological fact, biological reality. So I thought it was interesting that they made that comment that, wow, this is, they thought that there would be more variation depending on the length of the cycle. But when it comes to what is it that's going to determine the length of the luteal phase, it's the strength of your progesterone production. So the luteal phase is directly tied to the amount of progesterone that you're able to produce, the health of that corpus luteum, its ability to sustain and survive. And when we have certain things that are happening that are reducing our ability to produce progesterone, then that can shorten the duration of the luteal phase. It can lessen the actual amount of output of progesterone that is happening during the phase. And so there's a variety of things that we can observe. So again, this is something that I see regularly. And I guess what we can take away, especially because what the researchers, one of the things that they were highlighting were that some providers really stick to some of these myths. And so if someone has learned about the menstrual cycle in a textbook, but they've never really engaged with the menstrual cycle in the wild, in real life, they've never learned about charting, they've never viewed menstrual cycle charts of real women, they've never reviewed studies like this that look at real cycle data, then they might actually believe some of this nonsense, that the cycle is always 28 days and that the luteal phase is always 14 days and ovulation is always happening on day 14. And they might take that information and apply it in practice. They might provide advice for women for timing sex when they're trying to conceive, or for doing testing based on this X day of the cycle. Well, since ovulation always occurs on day 14, you should do this test on day 21 of your cycle and all that kind of stuff. So it does have serious implications, even though to me, it's so obvious that this is, we're human beings, we're not robots. We should be looking at the individuality between cycles. There's tons of variation, and we can look at menstrual cycle charting as defined by variation. That's one of the things that you can absolutely expect to see when we start diving into the menstrual cycle. It's certainly something that defines our fertility awareness mastery mentorship program, and that all of our practitioners have to learn to really jump in to the waters and kind of ride the waves of variation from client to client so that we can serve each individual woman, because no two cycles and no two charts and no two people have the exact same experience. There are certainly trends that we can pay attention to. The study clearly shows that there are trends, but on a cycle to cycle basis, there are definitely variations. We can absolutely count on that. You thought it would be easy. Teach them to chart their menstrual cycles, they said. Help them learn to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, they said. And then you saw the charts. You saw things that you didn't even know were possible, and you really don't know how to interpret them. Fortunately, I've created the perfect solution for you. I want to share with you our top resource for women's health professionals, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you. This new resource breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. It will give you the tools you need to better support your clients. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Another interesting piece of data on the luteal phase front, out of the whole cycle, 18% of cycles had a luteal phase of less than 11 days. So, that's 1 out of 5. That's like almost 20%, right? And so this was something I would say is quite consistent with what I see. I would say that in terms of the length, sure, I feel like that makes sense in terms of like about 20% of luteal phases that I see would be less than 11 days. But I would estimate a higher percentage of menstrual cycles where the luteal phase has other signs of deficiency. So even if the luteal phase length is okay, seeing PMS symptoms or premenstrual spotting or other signs and symptoms that would indicate that we should be looking to support progesterone. So I thought that was interesting as well. And they cited other research. So I'll just share this little tidbit with you. So they cited another researcher who they said, okay, this is what we found. We found that it was about 18% of the cycles had luteal phases of less than 11 days. And they said, this is in line with another researcher who actually found that 15% of the cycles that they had viewed were less than 11 days. And they went on to say that it has been proposed that all luteal phases of less than 10 days and 74% of 10-day luteal phases are abnormal, implying inadequate progesterone secretion. So this is just a nod, yet another nod to how the menstrual cycle can be used as a vital sign, because we can get some of this data that doesn't give us a specific progesterone measurement. It's not the same as a blood draw, but it can certainly alert us to maybe the need for a blood draw. And we can use that menstrual cycle to identify potential hormonal issues in a much less invasive way. We don't need to see a Dutch test every single month to be able to identify what's going on. We can look at this as a window into it and then order that Dutch test if need be, if there are signs and symptoms from what we're seeing in the cycle. So a couple other pieces of data that the study highlighted for us, they looked at a number of different factors. They looked at age and the menstrual cycle. So how did the menstrual cycle change depending on the age of the study participants? And they also looked at BMI. So they also looked at the weight part. So I think that these were two really interesting pieces of the study. What we find is that as women get older, as we get into our late 30s, early 40s, into that pre-menopause phase, premenopause or perimenopause is a word that generally indicates that 10-year period before menopause. And menopause is simply a word for your last period. And we identify that last period after 12 months have passed. So if you are, and the average age for menopause is about age 51. So somewhere around that time, your cycles do tend to start getting longer during that last 1 to 2 years before your last period. And so you might start going, 2 months without a period, or 3 months or 6 months. But it's only after you've had a period and gone a full year that we define that as menopause. So we define that retrospectively. And so what they found in this study, unsurprisingly, because before that last period, during the 10 years leading up to menopause, what tends to happen is we tend to start ovulating a little bit earlier in the cycle. So average cycle length is known to decrease a little bit because during this phase, ovulation tends to happen earlier and earlier. And this is related to how our follicles are developing. And there is some research that suggests that some of those follicles start developing towards the end of the previous cycle. And that's one of the reasons why we're ovulating earlier. So lots of interesting data there. So in line with other research and in line with what we know about how, cycle characteristics as we age, they did find that the average cycle length did decrease. So between ages 25 and 45, they said that the average cycle length was about 3 days shorter. So, instead of, let's say 28, 29 days, by the time a woman's into her early 40s, the average is shorter. So we could be looking at, 26 days or something like that on average. And so obviously within that, it doesn't mean every single woman's cycle is going to be X number of days, but it does mean that on average, we are seeing more frequent cycles that are shorter. And this is an observation that I've certainly made with clients as time goes on, as they find themselves in that late 30s, early 40s range, where if you were to chart your cycles for a whole year, because I've been charting for so long, these are things that I've been doing for years, but at the end of every year, I always find it interesting to look at like the median, mean, and mode. So if anyone remembers math class, so the mean is the average. So we calculate how many days your cycle was and we just calculate that average. The median is kind of like what the middle number is. And then the mode is like the most frequent cycle number. So I remember one year my mode was like 29 days. So I had 29 days like 6 times, but then, I did have a longer cycle, a shorter cycle, right? That kind of thing. So it was really interesting. This is interesting data to gather. So back to the topic of premenopause and cycle shortening. So what you tend to find as you get older is that when you look at a year's worth of cycles, as each year goes by, you're more likely to have the occasional shorter one. So where you never had a cycle less than whatever, X number of days, you're more likely to have that one 27-day cycle, or that one 26-day cycle, or that one 25-day cycle. And that might happen, every now and then. And then on average, your cycle length goes down. Maybe you have fewer longer cycles. Maybe you have fewer 32-day cycles now, or something like that, just to give an example. So these are things that, again, showed up in the study, and they're certainly in line with what I've seen in practice. And so the researchers also highlighted, so they said the average cycle length dropped by 3.2 days from age 25 to 45. And then the average follicular phase, so follicular phase, again, is just, from your period to ovulation, dropped by 3.4 days during the same period of time. So, this is the way that research is written. It's the follicular phase that is determining the fact that the cycle length is shorter. So again, as we were talking about earlier, it's really the length of the follicular phase that has the most significant impact on the total cycle length, because it's really ovulation that is the most variable part of the cycle. Ovulation varies much more than the length of the second half of the cycle, which is the luteal phase. So, nothing surprising there, but again, just really interesting data, especially since they had such a big data set. And I thought that the BMI information was also really, really interesting. So I think the researchers expected to see this huge correlation between a woman's weight and her overall menstrual cycle length and different changes. But the results were actually quite subtle. So, if I quote from the study, in our study, they say, we were not able to determine significant effects of BMI on ovulatory menstrual cycle characteristics. So they're saying, well, maybe we just didn't have enough women that had a higher BMI, but they did have a fairly decent number. What they did find was that the strongest effect that they saw was an increase of cycle length variation between women. So women who were at the highest BMI levels, they had a 14% higher rate of variation than women who had a normal BMI. And so I think what I would take from that is that there is some potential impact or some potential correlation between weight and overall menstrual cycles. But I think the big takeaway is that there really wasn't that much difference in the overall presentation of menstrual cycle parameters just because of a woman's weight. So if anyone's heard me, rant about PCOS and my challenges with clinicians not diagnosing it properly or making assumptions, assuming that if a woman is slim or lean, that she couldn't possibly have PCOS, even if she meets the characteristics of long, irregular cycles, or assuming that if a woman is overweight, she's going to necessarily have certain characteristics. I thought that this was so interesting that the researchers seem to be expecting there to be this huge correlation between cycle irregularity and weight. And really the results were quite modest. And overall, there weren't that much difference. There wasn't that much of a difference just because of a woman's weight. So again, this is one of the reasons why I love looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. It means that a woman can have a normal menstrual cycle independent of weight differences between women. And like I've always said, when we're looking at PCOS is a specific condition. And although it does increase the odds that a person might gain weight because of the insulin resistance and glucose intolerance and things like that, it doesn't absolutely mean that everybody who has more weight on them is going to have cycle issues. And this is what the research showed. The research showed that for the most part, weight was not a significant factor in terms of cycle characteristics. So from my perspective, my takeaway is well, yeah, that's what I've observed. I haven't observed that weight in and of itself is going to predict that the woman is going to have issues with her menstrual cycle. There are other factors that are far better at predicting if we're going to have cycle issues. And weight in of itself doesn't mean someone automatically has PCOS either. So even though there is a correlation between weight and PCOS, there are plenty of slim women who have no apparent weight issues who suffer from that condition and have that long, irregular cycle presentation. So yeah, that was something I found really, really interesting that I wanted to share and pull out of the study. But just to conclude, what we learned from the study is that, well, many of you who've been listening for a long time already knew this stuff, but the menstrual cycle is not always 28 days. Women do not always ovulate on day 14. And this is not how we should approach cycle charting or any goal-oriented cycle-related activities. So if you're trying to conceive, we really should be looking at your individual cycle when you start showing cervical mucus, when your ovulation actually is, and we shouldn't be making assumptions. You should be paying attention to mucus first, because many women ovulate before day 14 and many women ovulate after day 14. And only 13% of those menstrual cycles were 28 days. So I love this study. I think it's really useful to highlight some of the things that I've been harping on for, over 2 decades here. But I love it when we can actually get data. And especially in this study, there was so much of it, so much data. They had all these users, all these menstrual cycles that we could use from a huge data set. So I feel like there's no study that's perfect. And certainly we could talk about some of the limitations of the study and the fact that the women were just kind of passively charting and we were just gathering the data. They weren't instructed on specific ways to chart. And, we could argue how accurate is the data. Like we could go into all of that. But I think that looking at this real world data is so interesting, so beneficial, so useful, and so helpful, especially for those of you who might have had some pushback. If your menstrual cycles are not always 28 days and you're not always ovulating on day 14, but you've had difficulty conveying it to a provider, or if you have been working with clients who have had some of these challenges and you've been trying to educate them on how the menstrual cycle really works, however it falls, this data helps us to better convey what the menstrual cycle really does look like in the world and in the wild. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Again, if you are wanting to take a peek at this study, head over to fertilityfriday.com/521. And that is where you will find our show notes page with the link to the study and the information. And if you're loving these research episodes, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/research. And that's where you'll find the list of our other FAMM research series episodes. In these episodes, I always choose a really interesting study, or at least a study that was really interesting to me. And I do a bit of a deep dive to share what we can learn from it and how it relates to menstrual cycle health for both you and your clients and anything in between. And with that said, I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving our FAMM research series, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts towards the end of June, and early bird registration is open until the 14th of June. So there's still time to reserve your spot. There's no other program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.